Thank you for joining us for our panel. The idea here is to basically have a conversation with some students who are doing work to combat inequities in our education system. I want to start off by just giving a little bit of background on Student Voice. We are a student-run organization, student-led organization that's been around for about 4 years now with the goal of amplifying student voice in the education policy, creation, reform, and feedback processes. And so we support students all across the country to make meaningful changes in their schools and in their communities that are kind of student-driven and student-focused. Over the past year, Student Voices embarked on a national tour. The idea being that while much of our original work began on social media, that we weren't going to be able to hear all student voices unless we went to the communities and to the schools physically, in person. And so that's what we did. And the people on this panel today are students that we've met over the course of that journey. I do want to say a couple of things off the bat before we get into introducing some of our other panelists. In terms of the state of equity in our education system, we're in a state of crisis. The system is not equal. It does not work for all students. And if you come from a certain socioeconomic background, or if you look a certain way or talk a certain way, the system works better for you than for other students. In the 2013, 50% of Black students still had parents who had not completed a college education. 1.6 million students in America attend schools that have armed guards, but not college counselors. In 11 states, not a single African American student took the AP exam last year, and in 8, not a single Hispanic student took the AP exam in computer science. So we are not at a place of equity in the status quo, and so the conversation today is going to be around what are some of the causes and that are perpetuating those inequities still, and what are some of the things that students are doing to try and combat these inequities. We know that this is an important mission because when we don't combat these inequities, we face a lot of problems as a society. If we don't have a representative population of students that are going to college, that are being prepared to be successful in a new economy, our institutions become less representative. More and more students live lives that are worse off than what their parents did, and centuries-old projects of oppression and prejudice are reinforced. And so the mission of combating inequity, especially in the field of education, touches so many different aspects of our society. And so this is an important conversation that we're having today. So I want to give each of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about their stories. I will say, unfortunately, we lost one of our panelists earlier this morning. She didn't die or anything, but she did get stuck in the Newark airport. And so she wasn't able to join us, but she recorded a portion of her story to make sure that she could share it with you all today during the panel. So we'll play that recording after hearing from Zakir and Ben. But Zakir, you're a student at University of Virginia now. You're originally from Texas, where you participated in a lot of work dealing with the role that students specifically can play in advocating for more equitable policies and holding leaders accountable. Can you talk a little bit about your educational journey throughout high school, and also, what role you think student voice helped play in fighting for the equity that we're talking about?
So I'm a native Texan, grew up in Houston, did public school all my life, was on the yellow public school bus 1 hour to school, 1 hour back for 7 years. I think I could speak for any student in Texas or any student anywhere in saying that freshman year of high school was a mess. And that's just how freshman year goes. So freshman year starts, I have no idea what's going on. I have like 7 classes a day, 5 minutes in between. I have to get all my books together. I have to get all my stuff together, and it was a mess. But part of that mess was also because I felt like a nobody. I didn't feel like I mattered in school. I didn't feel like I had a voice. Nobody ever asked me what I thought. Just going through school, I kept noticing things like that could be a little better. That could be adjusted, or like this is a problem that needs to be addressed by the school. But no one ever asked me what I was thinking. No one ever asked me what I could do to fix those things. And being a freshman, I was shy, so I didn't say anything. And I think it's the same for pretty much any freshman anywhere. Zoom forward to the end of high school, senior year. I guess at the end of junior year of high school, I had a research project where basically I had to convene a group of students over a weekend and talk about like multiculturalism in the city of Houston in the future and things like that. So I did, right? So brought together 20 students at Rice University and a guest speaker just to talk about like Houston education and stuff like that. And that's something I've never done before at that point, but I think all of us have now done that many times. And that was the day I realized how powerful getting together a group of 20 students is and just talking about school can really be. So that day, we were talking about school. And somebody asked the guest speaker, how do we get more student voice into the education system? And it was kind of an off-the-book question, and he responds, I want y'all to figure it out. And then I want y'all to make it happen. And then a few minutes later, he leaves. And then, of course, we're talking like, okay, well, we got to figure this out now. Important person told us to do it. So they start talking, and they start brainstorming. And, of course, I organize the event, so then they look at me to make it happen. So talk about positive peer pressure.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened, right? So then the weekend's over, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, they came up with an idea, now I got to implement it. And the idea was basically to start a student government in our school district. Context for our school district. Houston Independent School District, HISD. It is the largest district in Texas. 215,000 students, 44 high schools, 300 other schools. It's big. And we were trying to figure out how do we get students represented in these schools. And the more we thought about it, the more it made sense and the more it clicked with our high school experience. Because I think by the time people are graduating, it clicks in their head. Like, wait a minute. I could have fixed so many of these things in my school. I had so many ideas, but never had the opportunity to share them. Just speaking for me personally, I spent 12 years every single day, 8 hours a day in classrooms. That adds up to about 16,000 hours. So I've never taken a class on education policy, but I learned education policy living it every single day. And the 20 of us were the same way. And so we thought, how do we get students involved? And so what we thought was, well, there's 44 high schools. What if we got these 44 high schools together and their student councils and other students who were also wanted to be involved and set up a student government on the school district-wide level? And we did. We brought together 125 students to a school board meeting. We brought together 80 students on a weekend for Saturday morning for a meeting. And we started doing this monthly at different high schools. And as we did this, we started picking up on the inequities like this. If I could snap, I would. We realized the countless ways in which there were just so many inequities, but depending on the school, depending on where you're from, depending on where you're born, depending on if you're on this side of the neighborhood, on that side of the neighborhood. And it bothered us. And so we started getting more and more involved in these issues. But at the same time, in realizing the inequities, we realized that all of us were doing pretty poorly too, in terms of inadequacies. That, this high school is more underfunded than this one, my high school is more underfunded than that one, but at the end of the day, all of our high schools are pretty underfunded. Right. So we went to Austin, right over here, down the street at the state capitol. We brought 100 students lobbying for an education bill that would have fixed some of those inequities. Just some context there. In 2011, the Texas legislature decided to cut $5.4 billion for public education.
Wow.
Texas at that point was around like 48th in the country for public ed funding per student. In a few years later, they brought back some of that money, but never refunded the whole thing. So naturally this bothered us, and naturally this affected us every single day. So we went to Austin, we talked about these issues, we wrote lots of letters to lawmakers, and they were very receptive. They took pictures with us, tweeted things, asked us questions, we talked to them. It was a good day. But a couple months happened and nothing goes on. So then we started asking lawmakers, why did this not happen? Why couldn't we fix the public education system? Why are we not refunding our schools? The recession's over, come on. And the response was, well, there's a court case going on, and so we want to wait for the Supreme Court to make a decision before we try to figure out what to do. And it's like, okay, that makes sense, I guess. And so context there, 2011 again, 600 public school districts sued the state of Texas, arguing that the state was unconstitutionally inadequately funding our schools, and inequitably as well. So that case was going to Supreme Court, so the lawmakers said, let's just wait for them to figure it out, right? So we said, okay, Well, politicians didn't do anything, so let's go ahead and let's go to the Supreme Court and try to figure this out. So we did another bold thing. We took 120 students to a board meeting. We took 100 students to Austin. Now let's write an amicus brief and send it to the Supreme Court. I was in AP government, learned about an amicus brief, so we said, let's do this.
So it's my turn to provide some context. The first time I read about Zakir was when they brought 100 students to the Capitol. The second time I read about Zakir in his group was when they submitted this amicus brief to the Supreme Court. What was it about?
Yeah. So the basic premise was that in the entire legal case, there's lots of numbers, there's lots of dry legal facts. Lawyers treat students as nameless, faceless numbers. They kind of have to. It's the nature of the profession. But we're not nameless, faceless people. Look at us. We have names. We have faces. We actually experience these decisions that happen in Austin. And so we wanted to kind of put names and faces. We wanted to shine that light into what it's actually like to be a public school student. There are 5 million public school students in this state. And every single one of them knows that Texas education is underfunded. But for some reason, people in Austin don't. So we kind of wanted to shed that light. So we put together a 35-page amicus brief where we just kind of gave student stories and just gave student perspective and just made the case for why our schools are underfunded, why our schools are inequitable, and what money could do to fix those things. Money could give us lower class sizes. Money could give us better teachers. Money could give us arts and extracurricular opportunities. Money could give us college and career readiness programs. A lot of talk about money in education is that these are like extras. No, these are fundamental. And that's the kind of case we're trying to make.
I think the most powerful part about the way you approach your advocacy is to focus on the stories themselves. And I think during a time in our country right now where it seems like the values of stories are being undermined by politicians who weaponize them for the purpose of alternative facts. Being able to use authentic stories to further a policy goal in like a positive way, I think it's really powerful. And you're right. If students are spending 35 hours a week in a classroom, they are the experts on what's working and what's not working in the classroom. Now, Ben, you are from California. You're a freshman now, and you've had a very interesting educational career. Part of that is due to the fact that you've been dealing with a learning difference for much of your life. Can you talk a little bit about that difference and how it affects the way you're kind of interacting with school and with education policy?
Yeah, thank you so much. So again, my name is Ben. I am a freshman at the University of California at Davis. My story starts in 3rd grade, and as Andrew mentioned, it is comprised of severe learning disabilities, things like dysgraphia, dyslexia, and slow processing disorder. And what I found in 3rd grade is that the system that I was in, it didn't work for me. I was falling behind in everything. I felt incredibly ostracized, not only by my friends, but my teachers. And I literally felt that I wasn't learning. I felt like I was wasting my time there and that I was just going through these prescribed emotions and motions that just really weren't for me. And so what happened is we realized that I had to switch out of that school. That was 2 years later. And I had to go to a specialized school, a school that could provide me the skills and resources I needed to become successful. I learned things like self-advocacy, self-resiliency, perseverance, and also metacognition, which is a skill of thinking about how your brain works. And the moral of the story is that if you learn differently, you have to learn how to learn differently. You have to do things in a different method if the prescribed method does not work. And these years were tremendously beneficial for me, and partly because I could see people like me who succeeded. I had an incredible network of mentors and people who wanted me to succeed. And gaining these skills for the first time, I could see that success could be something that could be bestowed within myself. This is after 3 or 4 years where I thought I'd end up flipping burgers at Burger King. It's not an exaggeration. But where I got to was this place of self-empowerment, where I realized that no one should go through the experience that I went through. That the experience that I went through was incredibly hard, and I realized that no one should go through it. And so my advocacy work began in San Francisco, where I was given a platform to speak up to my own teachers and to schools in the area, and also to the parents and teachers, and really unveil the stigma that exists and is so prevalent. And so now I'm a freshman in college. I'm doing really well, but it took so long to get there. There is so much work that happened in between. And it is combined by a struggle of personal self, trying to succeed in school, but also trying to succeed outside of school and be a prominent advocate. I think that for me, I need to feel like I'm making change or making an effort to make change, because for so long when I was young, I felt like it wouldn't be possible. So now I have these tools and I need to do it. But it's challenging. And there's a lot of institutional politics that happens in these organizations that I found. So in the organization that I worked for in San Francisco, there's a lot of politics that limited me. And part of me joining Student Voice is trying to work around that and raise the stories of individuals in random states and random locations who don't have access to this power of, or this availability of knowing that others like them learn differently or learn like them. That it's not just myself, but it's a whole community. And not even a whole community, things like Albert Einstein, Chuck Schwab, so many successful people here in the world. And the thing to note is that I was incredibly fortunate to go to school that could provide me the supports that I needed. This is a bit of a taboo subject, but I come from a very fortunate family, and a family that could put me into a school that was primarily white, primarily affluent. And needless to say, going there, I learned a lot of skills, but it was a rare opportunity. And learning these skills should not be a right. They need to be there should not be a privilege, should be a right. Because if 1 in 5 people can't learn in this structured, we need to make it available to so many more students that who aren't able to access these systems right now.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's most striking to me about your story, well, actually two things. First is the role that mentors, that communities, that adults in your life can play on trying to help you combat some of these challenges that you're facing in your own life, but also how it's not immediately obvious that you would be facing these challenges. And I think that's true for a lot of people who deal with learning differences or mental health issues, or even just are coming from abusive households. It's not always on the surface level that you can know what a student is bringing into the classroom with them. And so it requires talking to students in order to get that perspective. I want to go ahead and play Amanda's video so you can hear some of what she has to say. She's a really just brilliant young lady. She's from Eastern Kentucky, which is a rural area of the state. She's from a very poor school district, but she was fortunate in some of the resources that she had access to. So I'll go ahead and let's play this video real quick, and then we'll come back.
Hey y'all, sorry I couldn't make it today. I missed my flight to Austin because of a flight delay, and instead of coming in late, missing the presentation, and flying back to Boston tomorrow, I'm headed back to Boston like a responsible student facing midterms. But much like tech helps out in student voice, I'm hoping that this video will greet you well in the South by Southwest. This being South by Southwest, we'll be able to make some sort of tech thing happen here. But I feel that my narrative's a little different. So I come from rural southeastern Kentucky. I grew up as a low-income student. I grew up in an
All
abusive
areas
household.
within the terminal building are designated as smoke-free. Thank you for your cooperation.
So I grew up in Kentucky, rural southeastern Kentucky, which, as you know, is a red state. I grew up in an abusive household with just my father, and I ended up where I am right now because of a series of incredible adults. I can't stress the importance of the network of mentors and advisors and just people that I've had that that got me to where I am. So right now, I left home at 18. I am essentially a homeless student, technically. I filled out my FAFSA and had to declare myself independent. So I'm at a very different place than most students. And I got here in a very unconventional way. So my freshman year of high school, I got involved with the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team. And essentially what happened with the Student Voice Team is I reached out with the teacher mentor. I began getting involved. I met the team. They had told me some really interesting things and piqued my interest immediately. I wrote a piece, Poor Students Need More from Policymakers, and it got the attention of a private college counselor. It also put my student voice team career on hold because I got in trouble with my dad for writing about being poor. A lot of fun. A private college counselor, Jane Shropshire, offered to take me on for free. And this was my junior year of high school, so she was able to help me plan out my senior schedule and make sure that it was challenging. She was able to guide me through all of the steps of the college application process and essentially lead me to a Questbridge scholarship and lead me to Wellesley, where I am now. And it's been an incredible opportunity, but it hasn't come without challenges. So one of the main challenges I've faced in transitioning to college has been the cultural barriers. And I don't think you would expect that, being that I come from inside the United States. I'm going to like a normal college. This shouldn't be a problem, but it is. Remember, like, I come from rural southeastern Kentucky. I didn't know the names of several foods. I went to a persistently low-achieving public school, so my science education, my background in social studies, those sort of things is very, very limited. My math, even, like, my math skills are absolutely terrible, and that's almost 100% because of my high school education. One thing, if I could change one thing about my high school education, it would have been that that I was competing with students that had a lot more resources than I did. I was trying to take the same classes as them while they had extra time with the teachers, extra tutoring. I had to go straight home after school or I would get in trouble. I would change that competitiveness.
She sent me a text right after she sent this video in, and she let me know that she had to run to go get on her plane, so she wasn't able to finish. But she did want me to read out one last thing from her. Amanda says, "The thing I really want y'all to get from my story is that I'm not one of the lucky ones. My path from rural southeastern Kentucky to Wellesley, Massachusetts is because of the support network I had. Low-income students like me are capable of performing on the same levels of our peers, given the proper support. Education is freedom. Education is freedom from abuse, poverty, and other bad situations, but it has to be accessible." And I think Amanda's story really gets at the core of what this discussion is about. How do these either seen or unseen barriers, I've heard other people call them tripwires, prevent students from ultimately being successful in the education system on the one hand, and on the other hand, how can we partner with students both at the classroom level and at the advocacy policy level and try and combat and undo some of these barriers? And so to that end, I want to get specific with the two of you. Starting with Zakir, can you share with us some specific ways that the funding challenge that you all are facing in Houston affects students' education? That's one. And then two, I know that you're working on a new project now. Can you talk a little bit about how you think your advocacy work now in the legislative session can relate to trying to combat some of these inequities that we've been talking about?
Right. Every story can be connected to some policy. And I think a lot of the problems we have in education are because that connection is disconnected. So just thinking of stories. In our amicus brief, we brought up a lot of stories. People writing the amicus brief, some were like sort of me, who was sort of wonky, who just, for whatever reason, was capable of writing a legal brief, while others, were struggling through various things of their own. And so we kind of brought everybody in to write these stories and to get stories from other people. So it wasn't just like me writing this thing. And so we had lots of stories. One of them talked about being in a biology class where there was 50 people in the room and 40 chairs and trying to learn biology at the same time. It doesn't work. One of those stories was talking about taking economics and having textbooks that were 15 years old when you had to know about 2008 for the AP exam. Or another class that was, I forget what subject it was, but they didn't have the AP textbook, but they were taking the AP test. Things like that. I mean, those are stories that can be very clearly connected to funding issues. Lack of funding for textbooks, lack of funding for classes, lack of funding for this or that. I mean, these issues can be very directly connected to policy. And part of what we're doing in the amicus brief was making that very clear, was saying, here's a story, here's an example of how it really affects people inside the classroom, and here's why this policy needs to be changed to improve that. Here's why we need more funding, here's why we need more textbooks, here's why we need this or that. And so I think what we've lost in our education system, maybe we never had it, but that feedback mechanism. I was at a conference last week where someone presented on having feedback from school board, or having feedback where students give back feedback to the school board. And I was excited for the first time I'm hearing this about student voice and blah, blah, blah. And then I realized that the feedback was just looking at student test scores. That's not feedback. Feedback is actual stories. Feedback is actual people giving their perspective and telling adults what's going on in school, what do I need, what am I struggling with, here's how these things can be resolved. Because guaranteed, ask a student, they'll tell you. If children are a topic, have children on the table, because they will explain to you what they're going through and what can be resolved. And so what we were thinking about was, how can we actually improve this across the state, where we actually have student stories connected to policy and that feedback mechanism going around? And we came up with an idea. In the Texas Education Code right now, it says that before any major curriculum initiative, a school district board must include teacher input. We wanted to add the two words, and student. It's cost-free, it's common sense, We suggested the idea to some lawmakers, and now it has bipartisan support, and it's in the House and the Senate. HB 1585 in the House. So down the street, we have a bill in the Capitol right now. It's going to be heard in committee in the next few weeks, and we're going to do as much as we can to get it passed. It's being sponsored by Representative Jim Murphy in the House, a Republican, and Senator Sylvia Garcia in the Senate, a Democrat. And the bill will require that before any major curriculum initiatives, the school district includes student input. And in doing so, it creates that feedback mechanism. It connects stories to policy and policy to stories, and in doing so, I think we could actually have a situation where freshmen are helping fix the public education system. Because it's freshmen like me or like Ben when we were freshmen going through these experiences, if we were able to tell policymakers our stories, we could have fixed those things so that they're not repeating the same mistakes for the next generation of freshmen.
Exactly.
And so that's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. I quickly want to note, if anyone in the audience has questions that they'd like to ask, we're using Slido for this session. And so you can access it by going to slido.com and typing in South by Southwest EDU and ask any questions that you want. We'd be happy to respond to them. But I mean, I have questions that I want to keep asking. So in the meantime, I'll do that. Ben, I want to know specifically, how do your learning differences affect your everyday life in a classroom?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. I think there's a number of different ways about how my LDs affect me. I think most of it is my slow processing disorder. So it takes me such a long time to do everything. When Zakir may be reading for an hour, I'll be reading for 3 or 4 hours. So it takes me so long to do everything, and I have to work tremendously harder to bring up my comprehension rate because my brain isn't working at the speed that it should be. In terms of classroom, that works well as well. The same where paying attention to teachers or being distracted from people behind me or taking notes and keeping up with the lectures and making sure everything is organized. There's so many things to handle when you're in a lecture with 100 people and you have to take notes, think about how the notes can go to your essay, how they can go to your test, and organizing that. And it's hard, and it's so easy to get lost in it when you're in that kind of situation. And so thankfully, students at my school can get access to assistive technology, and that's tremendously helpful. And it needs to be more available to more students. So that's just a little bit.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And at the core of that, it almost sounds like a need for high quality, kind of dedicated teachers. And something else that we know to be true in the United States is that we have a problem retaining our high quality teachers. 14% of teachers quit after the first year, close to 34% within 3 years, and nearly 50% are gone by their 5th year. And so figuring out a way to recruit and retain these highly talented teachers, seems like one of the core pieces to overcoming some of these equity challenges. And as Zakir points out, issues like these are inextricably linked to funding. And so making the case for that in real terms, just as he's done, I think is quite important. I do want to shift a little bit to talking about kind of more on the advocacy side and more on kind of the current atmosphere that we're in. 2016 saw a lot of activism by way of Black Lives Matter and just other movements that were starting to bubble up. And I know that a lot of students, as a result, were having conversations about political activism and protest in school in a way that really didn't happen as much prior. And I think now that we're in 2017, with the new president, with what seems to be a very tension-filled political atmosphere, I'm sure that's kind of still happening now. I'd like to know, from this perspective of equity, from this perspective of diversity, how have you observed students in your communities or in your schools reacting to the current political climate? Have you talked about this in school? And what do you think the role a student should play moving forward as we start to figure out what education policy looks like in 2017?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so last year was a long year, and I think a lot of people felt the same way. Young people care about politics. Young people care about youth issues, or even just issues in general in the country. Young people have opinions on things like Black Lives Matter, on things, on various movements going on, feminism, what have you. But at the same time, young people also feel very disengaged. We kind of have this paradox going on, I feel like, where you see student walkouts and you see student protests and you see students getting on social media and posting this or that, but you're not seeing students at the polls, you're not seeing students volunteering, you're not seeing students calling their representatives. And I think this feeling of being not included, just being excluded, frankly. Feeling of students and just young people in general not feeling like they're a part of the process, and so they run away from that process, and they are thinking, we need a new process, we need Bernie Sanders, we need this, we need that. And some of that's good, because it's getting students involved in some way, but it's also testament to the crisis we're in, where students don't feel like the traditional means of getting involved are working for them. And it's testament to the crisis of civic engagement I think we're facing in this country. And some people might say, well, okay, college students don't vote. It's fine. But what about in 10 years? What about in 20 years? When our generation is the leaders and the movers and the shakers of the future of America, if we're not voting, if we're not getting active traditionally, if we're not actually thinking about these issues and then calling our representatives and senators, we're going to have a serious problem in this country. And I think that for our leaders, they just sort of, even if they get that, they don't know what to do, and even if they do know what to do, they pass it on to somebody else. I'm just thinking of Texas, right? The Texas state legislature defunded our schools. Then the school districts sued the state. And then the legislator said, well, we'll figure it out, but first let's wait for the court. The court finally made a ruling, by the way, on the amicus brief case that we had, where they actually cited in favor of the state and then passed it back onto the legislature saying, you guys should do something, but we're not going to require you to do something. So again, it's like we're like a football being passed around. And in the same time, we're not actually feeling included, we're not feeling welcome in the process, so then we get disengaged and we start doing other things. And that affects politics, but also affects things like, church attendance, or participation, or volunteering, or being involved in the community. Students have become more individualized, and we're feeling more dispossessed from the system, and so we're leaving that system, and that hurts all of us. And so I think while students are caring more, they're not caring in the ways that we may even want. And that's a problem and a crisis that we need to fix in this country.
Absolutely. And I mean, what role do you think, Ben, students can play in doing it and engaging with these systems, either at a at a national level, and I know that some of the work that you do kind of has been at the national level, or even at the local level. I mean, have you seen in your advocacy instances where by engaging with the system, students can really contribute to improving it?
Yeah, so I want to speak a little bit to my experience at UC Davis. And obviously, with the election, that had a lot of implications. But Davis itself is, yes, it's a very liberal place, but it's also very politically diverse. You'd be surprised by the amount of supporters of both candidates coming together. And there's a little bit of a hush-hush. For many people don't want to speak up because they feel like their stories would be reported to some kind of office where the other side feel like there's nothing to talk about because there's no problem on their end. And so there's a huge disconnect between the problems facing America and the and students. And so while they do want to get involved, while they do care, there's no incentive for them to come out and really pay attention. And I think that's crucial. And I agree with Zakir that it can't be like that. And so one of the things that we're doing here at UC Davis is that UC system-wide, we have a series of legislative directors who meet and discuss legislation that affects them. And they sponsor and advocate for legislation and the statewide system. And so that's incredibly impactful. But not enough people are a part of it. So many people feel disengaged and like they don't matter. And so what I want to do is reverse that and really show that students and their voices really do matter and that they are essential to the thread of human life. And so I think a lot of what we're doing is trying to activate these voices.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think that's, in some ways that's what it takes, especially when so many of the young people who, we're talking about end up on the wrong side of these inequities, also kind of simultaneously end up silenced, either because they've dropped out of school for some reason, or because they're being constantly suspended, or because students as a general demographic aren't taken very seriously when it comes to contributing meaningfully to school improvement efforts. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is actually one of the questions on Slido as well. What advice do you have for school districts, for teachers who know intuitively that amplifying student voice in their work or incorporating student voice more into their work would enhance some of what they're trying to do, but are maybe unsure about how to make that happen, or even might be a little anxious about turning over power to students in that way?
I'll chime in, and then I'm actually going to toss it back to you, Andrew, because I think you have a lot of experience on this question too. But from my perspective on this, I think every school is different, every district's different, every classroom is different. The most important thing is to really spend an hour and figure it out with students. So instead of just asking me, go to your high school students, get a group of them together and say, hey, we want to include your voices somehow. What mechanism should we use to include your voices? So don't just come up with something and then get the high school input, but get the some high school students in the room, come up with a plan together, and then implement that plan. So that way it's organic, and that way those students themselves can tell you what's the best way for us to be heard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, I'm originally from Kentucky. I should have mentioned that in the beginning, but I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky. One of the methods that we've been using to try and experiment with this question is something called the student voice audit. And what we did was we went into a local junior high school. We surveyed the entire student body. We surveyed all the teachers. We conducted around 3 or 4 dozen roundtable discussions with students, one-on-one interviews with administrators and teachers, as well as a kind of policy audit and classroom observations. And we packaged it all into a report that was supposed to kind of speak to the state of student voice in the school. And some of the findings from the original survey that we put out were really striking and spoke to the disconnect. For example, we asked the question of students, what is the most important issue in your school that needs to be addressed? And nearly 2/3 of the students wrote in the word bullying in some way or another, either cyberbullying or in the classroom, physical, in between classes, in the bathrooms. And we asked the same question to the teachers. Tell us what is the most important issue in your school that you think needs to be addressed. And not a single teacher on a single survey mentioned bullying at all. So here you are with hundreds of students writing this in, and teachers seem almost unaware. Another really striking example is we asked students to respond to the statement, I really want to learn, with responses ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. 80% of the students responded either agree or strongly agree with the statement, I really want to learn. But when we asked the teachers the same question, respond to the statement, my students really want to learn, it was exactly the opposite. 80% of teachers either disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, my students really want to learn. So there are these kinds of disconnects that I think we're getting at when we say that student voice can play a role in bridging some of these just deficits. I mean, it was just striking to see some of the differences in these survey responses. And the worst part was the number of students who said to us, no one has ever asked us these kinds of questions before. And clearly someone should be. Ben, in your experience, what advice would you have for teachers or for school districts that are looking to more meaningfully incorporate student voice? And you can answer it from a number of different perspectives, but I'm especially interested to know, students with LDs, what kinds of special considerations need to be made when looking to incorporate student voice in that way.
Yeah, so something that I always say is that students are almost the founders of students with learning disabilities are almost the founders of the student voice and music movement, because from very early on we've been forced to advocate for ourselves, for extra time, for computers in classroom, for wellness checks, for different types of technology. Anywhere across the board, these accommodations, we have to advocate for them. They don't come to them. And unfortunately, we have to be the squeaky wheel and go to places like the Disability Center and demand that they give us the tools that we need to learn. And so I think a big part of that is that not putting it on us to not do it until we come to you, but really value, not just tokenize. There's a difference between tokenize and value, but clearly value our input. And I've had students that really want to know, and I've had teachers that want to know, and I've had teachers that just could not give a damn. And it's important to know that it's a two-person tango, the teachers and the students. And so when bearing that in mind, it's important to take time out of the day to say, how is this affecting you? How do you feel? Are you happy? Are you sad? And that leads me to another point, is that brings out issues like mental health, where you can't see those things unless you ask, and you can actually recognize it based on their facial recognition and things of that nature. I think that's another huge taboo subject here across the country, especially on my campus. And that requires a lot of speaking up for things like accommodations and wellness improvements. But it's so taboo that there's a lot of systems that aren't equipped to bring that. So I think a lot of that is encouraging the student voice, just as you encourage the teacher voice, and pairing these together to make a more cohesive movement going forward.
Excellent. I want to bring it back. Both of you have spoken about the need for students to be involved. Both of you have spoken about the effectiveness that students can bring to the table when they are involved in advocating, either on a large scale in terms of the amicus brief or even a smaller scale in terms of just the proper accommodations and support from their school. I guess the question, and this is also one of the Slido questions, but during a time where there is such a strong narrative of youth disengagement, what do you think it is that does successfully motivate students to get involved, either with organizations or with policy or with politics? What is it that really does bring students to the table?
You want to go first, or should I?
Sure.
Okay.
So I think that the big piece here is that it's showing that your voice really does matter, that it does count. Because many students feel like there's no use in trying if it's just going to get squashed in bureaucracy. And so the idea is setting up platforms and paradigms where it requires student voice. So things like having seats at your local board meetings, or setting up committees. At UC Davis, we have a number of different committees that advise the student government, and the student government makes a significant amount of decisions, and that's crucial. In San Francisco, SFUSD, the Unified School District, they have a student board, and the student board makes a lot of the decisions, and that's, again, it's important. But what it goes to show is that it's institutionalized opportunities, and it's easy and obvious, it's low-hanging fruit to create them. Things like disability boards, so many different issues. And so I think that's a primary solution.
Yeah, I think there's this misperception that a lot of students don't care. They don't care about their school, they don't care about getting involved, they don't care about advocating for themselves. But I mean, if you want to know what perseverance looks like, go to a public high school. You're going to see kids who are homeless, who are getting better grades than you are. You're going to see kids who have abusive parents who work a full-time job so that they can pay for their parents' housing. You're going to see kids who blow your minds with what they do and what they can do and how hard they work and how much they care. The problem that we run into is that these same students often feel like it's the others who don't care. It's like when they try to advocate for themselves, when they try to fix things, that they keep running into obstacles. And if that's the case, then they're going to say, what's the point? Why keep investing in this if it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere? I'll just invest somewhere else. And usually those somewhere else's are down the rabbit hole, right? And so to answer your question, I think that students do care, students do want to be involved, students will advocate for themselves, like you said, Ben. But it's these institutional barriers that keep coming up. And so it's not about changing the student culture in any way. It's sort of changing the way the infrastructures and the institutions exist so that the student voice and those student passions and those student interests can be let in. And that's the key.
Absolutely. So both of you are in college now, and we hear a lot about college and career ready. My question, one of our last questions, what skills do you wish you had learned during your high school careers that you feel like would help you better handle your college experience and some of the stuff that comes at you during that?
I think a lot of these can be filled in with the I wish somebody had told me blank.
Yeah.
So it's for me. I wish somebody had told me about the FAFSA. I wish somebody had told me about the SAT subject test. I wish somebody told me about this college over there. I wish somebody had told me, all these things that are so basic that don't require that much effort, but for some reason I just wasn't told. And that's coming from my experience. Now imagine other students who go through even much worse in high school. All these basic things that people just assume, oh, that student's not going to college, so why bother telling them about an SAT subject test? No, tell them, right? And then in terms of skill sets, it's things like time management, study skills. I'll give one quick story. about how, well, first a quick statistic. HISD, the school district in Houston, it has a 70% post-secondary enrollment rate, which is pretty great. 70% of students in this lone school district are actually going to college or vocational school. But the graduation rate is 15%. So all these students show up at college, they got good grades in high school, and then they're struggling, and then they drop out. And then they feel like they've either been lied to, cheated, or both.
Mhm.
Something went wrong. People told them they were doing great, and they show up at college and realize that they can't do much. And so telling students, empowering students, informing them what college is like beforehand, we feel like we do it, but we don't do it enough, and sometimes we only tell the students who already know. Sometimes what happens is like you only advise the students who are already advising themselves on how to get to college and tell them about the subject test, while all those other students are left behind. They show up at college, they don't know what's going on. So it's that information, again, it's that feedback, it's that communication between students and administrators, students and teachers, students and principals, students and board members that needs to be happening more and more and more.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the I wish someone told me is that when a lot of people, particularly freshmen, get to college, there's this feeling that, oh, I shouldn't have gotten in here. This school's a mistake. I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready to live here on my own. And a lot of that is because there's such a huge gap between high school and college.
Yeah.
There's this radically different way of living, and I know I wasn't ready for it, and it took me a whole semester to get ready and to prepare. And I think something that I've learned from friends is this is ever more important for students who have under resources, people whose parents didn't go to college, for example. And I think it's important for high schools to really show their students that you are meant to be here. Our world really does need your voice.
Yeah.
That's crucial. That's super important. I cannot stress that enough.
Yeah, and the truth is, while we have a lot of challenges that we're still facing within the education system here in America, we've made quite a bit of progress. We're at an all-time high with high school graduation rates. College enrollment for Black and Hispanic students is up tremendously since 2008. But we do still have, quite a bit of work to do. And at its core are these kind of hidden barriers, these hidden tripwires that students face throughout the education system, starting from the very moment they first enter school. I mean, some of the achievement gaps that you might hear in the news all the time are evident when students first enter school. And so figuring out how to combat some of those, but more importantly, how students can play an active role in that, I think is critical. I want to give each of you an opportunity to quickly share any final thoughts that you have. And then I will also say that for anyone that wants information about student voice or about how to get involved in some of the work or storytelling work that we're doing, can come up afterwards, and we have some pamphlets and some cards that we can hand out. But
yeah. So first, thank you all for being here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being interested in these kinds of issues. I guess real quick to close and answer one question on the Slido. As an Austin resident, how can I support the student feedback bill? The answer to that is just come talk to me afterwards. Because us three, we sound very articulate, but at the end of the day, we're still improvising most of the time. How to get a bill passed in the Texas legislature, I'm still trying to figure it out. So if you can help in any way, or even if you don't know how to help, but if you come talk to me, I'd love to get your support.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, again, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all. For me, continuing on my common thread of sharing stories, today my organization for back home is actually launching a blog, and Tamir and Amanda are our featured writers, and what it is it's featuring stories of students overcoming obstacles, very similar obstacles that we've talked about today. So it's called SXSWedu. You can find it at medium.com/accessibility. And if you're interested, please come up to me and ask about it at the end of the panel.
Yep, and we have just tweeted out a link to it from Stu Voice's Twitter as well. So if you want to find a link to it, you can find it from there. Sounds good. Well, thank you both for being here. We thank you, Amanda, from Newark or Boston or wherever she is right now. And thank you all for being part of this conversation. We think it's incredibly important that South by Southwest EDU continues to provide platforms for student-led, student-driven sessions that relate to education, since, in our view, we're one of the critical stakeholders in the education system. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conference.